Hello everyone, I'm Sandy Andrew, your host of the Universal Learning Series radio show, where we discover the spiritual and scientific universe. Welcome. On this edition of the show, we'll be featuring Nick Redfern, author of the book The Real Men in Black, which is about evidence, famous cases, and true stories of these mysterious men and their connection to the UFO phenomena. And let's welcome author Nick Redfern back to the Universal Learning Series radio show. Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Hey, Sandy. I'm doing good, thanks. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Good. Thanks for joining us here this morning to discuss your interesting book, The Real Men in Black. The title, Nick, is misleading in a positive way because you somewhat have an idea what it's about, but then when you start reading the book, you're like, this is not quite what I thought it was going to be. So give us a synopsis of the book, The Real Men in Black.
Yeah, well, I think I call the book The Real Men in Black because it's an expose, what I believe is the genuine phenomena rather than just one phenomenon behind the subject. But I think when most people think of the Men in Black, and this is sort of largely prompted by the Hollywood Men in Black movie starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, initially people assume that if you're talking about Men in Black, you're talking about, quote, government secret agents silencing people because of their UFO knowledge. And although that is a part of it, what I found is that the more you dig into the Men in Black mystery, it's far stranger than that. And goes down some sort of very weird, almost paranormal and sinister pathways. So the book is a study of the real Men in Black, but the real Men in Black may not be what most people think they are, because, as I said, they get their opinions largely from, TV shows and pop culture. But that doesn't take away from the fact that, there are government people out there who have, been responsible for a lot of Men in Black reports. But equally, there are some sort of truly strange reports where the Men in Black don't even appear human in some respects, and that takes it down highly controversial pathways. So what I've done in the book is to look at the most important historical cases and also present a large number of new cases, and then from there in the second part of the book look at the different theories. Are they government agents? Are these entities alien, paranormal? Could they even be time travelers? Are they occult entities? Or is it the actual answer a combination of all these theories that have led to, the creation of the Men in Black scenario, if you like?
Well, let's start with this. On chapter 1, you talk about Albert Bender, and I think you do a very good job of setting the tone for the remainder of the book. You inform the reader very well that this is something above and beyond normally earthly perceptions of the 21st century. So let's talk a little bit about Albert Bender. I never heard of the guy before until I read your book.
Oh, okay. Well, Albert Bender was one of the people who was sort of in the early formative years of ufology. When the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting occurred in the summer of 1947, of course, it got a lot of people interested, not just the military and the government, but the general public. And over the next couple of years, people began to set up early UFO research groups. And Albert Bender did this with a group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Mm-hmm. And probably going far beyond even Bender's wildest dreams, it expanded into a huge organization with links and contacts all around the world, literally thousands of people. But Bender himself was an unusual character. He lived in, quite literally, an offshoot of the attic in his stepfather's home, and he decorated it with all sorts of sort of monstrous pictures on the walls and would hang plastic spiders from the ceiling, and he was very much into the occult, both in the world of fiction and non-fiction. He studied deeply the real-life world of the occult, but he was also a big fan of horror fiction and things like that, and gothic horror novels. And so in other words, he was sort of living in this creepy attic in a world dominated by the occult. And as time went on, as I said, his International Flying Saucer Bureau got more and more attention, and even attracted official attention, we know now. Actually got hold of some FBI files on Bender showing the FBI knew all about his group and what he was up to. And what happened was that in late 1953, barely a year or so after it had been formed, Bender abruptly shut down the organisation and quietly alluded to a number of close friends who then sort of spread the story, and before you knew it, it was here, there and everywhere, that 3 men had visited him and warned him to stop his UFO studies and to close down his group if he knew what was good for him. Now, the inference at the time was that, well, these have to be, the FBI, the CIA, the Air Force, or somebody like that. And we do also know through the Freedom of Information Act that government agencies were watching some of the early UFO groups. So that's, it wouldn't be so strange if that was the answer. But over time, the story, Bender's story, finally sort of spilled out into the public domain. And what initially appeared to sound like 3 fairly menacing guys who turned up on the doorstep flashing credentials and saying, "Hey, Albert, it's about time you stop doing this or else," turned out to be something very different. Bender described these entities as being sort of shadowy, almost like wraith-like beings that he would go, for example, he'd go to the cinema late on a Saturday night to see the latest sci-fi or horror movie, and he would talk about how on his walk home he would feel this eerie presence following him. Or also in the cinema, on one particular night, a famous encounter he talked about when the cinema was practically deserted. He was sitting there and had this feeling that somebody was watching him, and turned round to see this sort of weird, menacing-looking man in black with the classic fedora-type hat and black clothes, but also with what looked like self-illuminated, glowing eyes just staring at him. It was sort of like a cross between a man in black and, a vampire or something like that. And Bender also talked about how in the months that followed, poltergeist activity broke out in his attic, and how on several occasions these men in black literally sort of manifested in the room. And I kind of describe it as, the way his portrayal comes across. It was like sort of 3, giant spiders bearing down on a little fly caught in a web. That they were sort of just menacing, almost ethereal creatures rather than government agents, and it really was Bender that spawned the beginnings of the Men in Black mystery. And as I point out in the book, it truly probably would not exist in the form it does today, if even at all, had Bender not had this encounter and then talked about it, and then the whole thing sort of spiraled from there.
Okay, then you move on, Nick, and you talk about Gray Barker. And he was involved with the IFSB as well, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Barker was an author who, like Bender, had an interest in UFOs, but also a deep interest in paranormal phenomena and the occult. And Barker was a very good atmospheric writer. He wasn't just someone who would, write on the 10th of June, 1947, Mr. Smith saw a blue light in the sky. He was one of these authors who wrote in the classic, it was a dark and stormy night type scenario, So he was
make the most of it.
So he was really someone, who could, I guess, get the reader really sort of into the heart of the story and tell an atmospheric tale. And Barker published a book in 1956 titled They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was a study of Barker's UFO research, but a substantial part of the book dealt with Albert Bender's experiences. Now, Barker himself, when he immersed himself in the UFO subject and writing about the Men in Black, he actually got a visit from the FBI wanting to know all about Albert Bender's IFSB. So this sort of complicates the story because, initially, as I said, people thought Bender had been visited by the FBI. Then Bender himself said, no, it was far weirder. But then we find Barker, his colleague, did get visited by the FBI, so it sounds like there's a possibility that there are actually, even way back then, sort of 2 categories of Men in Black, the government agents and the weirder ones. And Barker got really sort of freaked out by this, I wouldn't say it was an interview, it was more of an interrogation by an FBI agent. Now people say, well, Barker was an atmospheric, imaginative writer. How do we know he didn't just sort of make the story up as a means to sort of promote his book and torture Bender? Sort of Barker had that kind of sense of humour where he wouldn't lie, but he did kind of, he wasn't above twisting stories a little bit and exaggerating them to to make a good story into a great story, you know, but it still had a basis in fact. Now people say, well, maybe that's what he did with this one, but I used the Freedom of Information Act with the FBI to try to file for records on Bender and Barker, and sure enough, I got hold of them, and they showed that Barker and Bender were well known to the FBI. They had files on both men. And the most amazing thing of all was that there's actually a memo in the Barker file where none other than FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover actually ordered one of his agents to get hold of a copy of Barker's book. They knew too much about flying saucers. And it was specifically given to Hoover to read. So, you know, we have Bender and Barker sort of scrambling around writing little self-published books on the Men in Black, and then a couple of years later, their book and their story is actually being discussed in the heart of the FBI by the director of the FBI, no less. So, you know, we know that there was a history and a reality to the phenomenon, and that that Barker at least was visited by someone who at the time probably was dressed, you know, in a black suit and a hat. That was the mode of dress then. But it's, you know, as I said, it gets complicated because Bender's Men in Black sounded similar in terms of appearance, but they had these paranormal aspects to them as well.
Well, Nick, you may find that your book may be read by the FBI in due course, so...
Well, I didn't libel them or anything like that. I just related the facts. You know, I mean, that's what the file... All I can do is sort of relate what the files say, and that's what the files say, that Hoover said, you know, I want a copy of this book. Get it, copy for me, so...
Sure. Now, moving on to the 1960s, who's this, is it Brad Steiger?
Brad Steiger, yeah.
Steiger, okay.
Yeah, well, Brad Steiger was someone, or is someone still. I mean, Brad's written a tremendous amount of books. Like, I think he's just published his 172nd or something like that. He writes about all sorts of aspects of the paranormal, whether it's UFOs, you know, Bigfoot, ghostly phenomena, you name it. But particularly in the 1960s, Brad became the recipient of a lot of reports of Men in Black encounters, some from friends and colleagues, some in the military, and some from people, you know, who read his books, which is a natural thing, you know. I think every author finds that. People read the books and then they contact you with their own accounts. Mm-hmm. But Brad received a number of very intriguing Men in Black type stories. One particularly where a colleague of his had actually been tailed all across London by three sort of very short, as he described them, sort of oriental looking, that was the wording he actually used, three men in black suits who seemed to be following him, and then literally came up to him one day and said, you know, tell Brad Steiger we're going to be visiting him. And, you know, it was sort of a weird, sinister, is probably the best way to describe it, account. And, you know, Steiger himself, when he got into the Men in Black mission, he was like, well, you know, bring it on, I'm not frightened of the Men in Black. And, you know, I think there was this assumption, as there was on the part of many people within the early years, that this is just government people keeping tabs. And then, over time, Gray began to realise that, you know, no, it's not just that there's whoever these weirder-looking Men in Black are, which they're often sort of described as like 5 foot to 5'5", with sort of slanted eyes, very white skin, emaciated, almost sometimes to like looking like they've got anorexia or something like that, and they don't seem sort of overly aware of our customs and behaviours, and you know they just seem barely sort of you know recognisable as human beings beyond the fact that you know they sort of resemble us physically, and this is the sort of the category of Men in Black that Brad himself sort of dug into to a significant degree. You know, not just focus on the government angle, but a realisation came to him that, hey, you know, this isn't the military or the Pentagon or whoever, that, you know, these guys, they look weird, they sound weird. You know, people talked to Brad about how, for example, you know, they turn up on the doorstep, knock on the door, and then when the interview or interrogation is over, they'd leave, and then the person would think, well, hang on, why did I let them in? And they'd race to the front door, and they're gone. You know, no sign of a car, no footprints in the dirt or anything like that. It's just as if they'd materialised and, you know, dematerialised. And that's a lot of the cases Brad uncovered and still uncovers, fall into that path or that category of, high strangeness.
Nick, you write about Mothman arrives in Point Pleasant, 1967. What's that about?
Well, the Mothman, I'm sure, again, everybody, if they're not fully conversant with the Mothman stories, probably heard of Mothman, sort of made famous in the movie The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere in 2002. But the movie itself was based on a book of the same name, The Mothman Prophecies, written by John Keel. Now, John Keel was probably one of the most acclaimed writers ever of real-life paranormal phenomena. And in the mid-1960s, there was a wave of strange activity in the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It was almost like the world of the paranormal had basically sort of said, we're going to target your town. And over the course of about a year, there were countless reports of UFO activity in and around the town, ghost-like phenomena, poltergeist activity, alien abductions, contactee cases, but the two most prevalent and recognizable ones, one was Mothman, which is, its name kind of gives it like a cartoonish, Batman type imagery, but that's actually not what Mothman was described like. It was very much described as like a disturbing looking, shadowy winged figure with glowing red eyes that in some occasions you could sort of only barely see it out of your peripheral vision. It had sort of that phantom-like aspect to it, and a lot of people viewed it as like a menacing thing, but others viewed it as like a creature that would appear when disasters were about to happen, and it was trying to warn people rather than provoking the disaster. And certainly the sightings of Mothman culminated in the collapse of Point Pleasant's Silver Bridge in December 1967, where literally dozens of people were killed and the cars just plunged off the bridge into the water. And many people in town and people like Keel did associate the presence of Mothman with the collapse of the bridge, whether it caused it or, as many people believe, that it was like a warning presence. Is debatable. But when all this weird activity was going on, whether Mothman, UFO sightings, contactee cases, etc., at the same time, all across Point Pleasant, people were seeing the men in black. Somebody would just be, the doorbell would ring at 2 in the morning or something, and they'd go to the door, and there'd be this weird little guy in a black suit and hat asking all sorts of strange questions. And the people would feel very often disturbed and upset by these experiences, not really knowing why. It wasn't just, if you got a sort of fairly traumatic visit from government agents who threatened you, that would be one thing. But the feeling the people got in Point Pleasant was very different. It was almost like an unsettling feeling that you were dealing with something malignant almost, is probably the best way to describe it. There was something very off-putting about these people to the point of being disturbing, but the people couldn't, put their finger on what it was that they found, so unsettling about the Men in Black. But, they would tell people not to talk about UFO experiences. That wouldn't be like outright threats. It would almost be like a subtle warning where you would think, well, hang on, did that guy just threaten me? But it wouldn't be like an outright threat along the lines of, if you continue to talk about your UFO experience, you'll die. It was more, letting the person join the dots, so to speak, but an inference that, it would be a good idea for you to stop. And they would turn up at the strangest times, like I said, 9, 10 o'clock at night, 2 in the morning. And often they would ask strange questions that didn't even seem relevant. Sometimes they claimed to be census takers. And then after they started asking a few questions about the census, they would say, if you had any strange dreams, how many children live in the house? Which sounds like a census-type question, but then they jump to another question, have you ever seen a UFO? And I just try to unsettle and unbalance the people, which actually worked. And I talk in the book about one particular theory from a man named Joshua P. Warren, paranormal researcher, who had a theory as to why the Men in Black turned up during the Mothman reign, if you like, and he felt or speculated on the possibility that, could these entities be time travelers? Are they is Mothman some sort of time-traveling, meddling entity, and could the Men in Black almost be like time cops, trying to sort of resolve and prevent time paradoxes from occurring, and sort of chasing these meddlesome creatures like Mothman who are intent on bending time, so to speak?
Yeah, time cops.
yeah. Which would be kind of ironic. I point this out in the book, if the Men in Black actually aren't, menacing, threatening entities, but they're actually sort of just, trying to help us, that there are meddlesome people trying to change past, present and future for their own benefit, and the Men in Black turn up when these people are doing this as a means to try and resolve and, fix the timeline, so to speak.
You talk
Which
about...
gets into very bizarre areas, so...
Oh, yeah. You talk about photographic evidence in your book as well, and there was one part that I read I thought was very interesting, that there was a picture taken in some newspaper, and you'll know the name, and it was a certain birds or something was in the picture, and people remember seeing that photograph in the newspaper, and then they researched it later on, and nobody can find this picture that was published in this newspaper.
Yeah, this has become known as the Thunderbird photograph, and what it basically alleges to be is a photograph taken in the United States in the latter part of the 1800s, which seems to show like a gigantic bird-like creature, like a huge pterodactyl-type creature, allegedly pinned to the barn doors of a barn in the late 1800s, and people... literally dozens and dozens of people, possibly even hundreds of people within the Fortean world, if you like, authors, researchers, and just interested people, claim to have seen this photograph in various magazines in the early 1960s, magazines like Argosy or Fate and magazines like this. And many of these people are still alive, and they say, we saw this photograph, and everybody's gone to try and look for it. No one can find it today. All these different magazines where it's presumed to have been seen, or people were actually certain they'd seen it. All the issues from, the 1960s, the period when the picture surfaced, have been scoured, page by page, and the picture cannot be found literally anywhere. Now, people say, well, a picture can't just vanish from a whole range of magazines, can it? Surely. And of course you would say no. But again, in the book, in the section where I interviewed Joshua Warren about the time travel angle, he wonders if there could be a tie-in here with the Men in Black, and his view is that maybe the Thunderbird photograph really did appear in these magazines, but if the Men in Black are kind of time cops, and their job is to manipulate the past, present and the future to prevent any disasters from occurring, what about the hypothesis that, there was some reason why they didn't want us to know about this Thunderbird-type entity, and they went back and then, reworked the past and made sure that the photograph never appeared in the magazine or the magazines. And so people remember it today, but the past being manipulated obviously didn't wipe their memories out, but the past being manipulated to where, in essence, the picture didn't exist, or at least it didn't exist in one past, but in another past it did. So, this gets into sort of areas where your head can just spin right up your shoulders, I guess. But, it's an interesting theory. I mean, granted, it's a hypothesis, and because, when you start talking about time travel, you are getting into a lot of hypothetical areas that do go into sort of fringe science, and you have to do a lot of speculation. But the fact is, which is we cannot get away from, that countless people reported seeing this picture, and now it just cannot be found. It is like it's been wiped off the face of the earth almost.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's a hard fact right there. Who is Mr. Colin Bennett? And he meets Mr. X. What's that about?
Well, Colin is a British-based author and researcher, and Colin focuses on a lot to do with UFOs, but he gets into a lot of esoteric areas, rather than just the nuts and bolts angle for the entire UFO phenomenon. And in the early 1980s, Colin, like a lot of people who sort of dug into the more alternative, fringe aspects of ufology, got a visit, or I should say his girlfriend initially got a visit from a man in black, and Colin turned up at the house. And, he still remembers it to this day vividly, as what happened was he was walking home late one night and saw this sort of strange aerial display in the sky, which seemed to change from like a light to an aircraft to like a modern-day flying triangle, which are very prevalent in UFO research circles today. And he raced back home to tell his girlfriend, and lo and behold, there was this weird man in the house already. And Colin expressed a lot of concern that his girlfriend had actually let the man in, a complete stranger at night. And this is something that we find in a lot of Men in Black reports, that it's almost as if they have some sort of sway over the person, where, if somebody knocked on your door at 10 o'clock at night, dressed in a suit, hat and sunglasses, and looked pretty menacing, you probably wouldn't let them in, without some sort of ID. And even if they had ID, you might not want to let them in.